In ancient China, power was a man's game. For over 2,000 years, the dragon throne belonged exclusively to emperors, never empresses. The very idea of a woman ruling the vast Chinese empire was not just unthinkable, it was considered a violation of the natural order itself. Yet one woman shattered this ancient barrier, ascending to heights no woman before or since has ever reached. Her name was Wu Zetian, and she would become the only legitimate female emperor in all of Chinese history. But her rise to absolute power came at a price so dark, so brutal, that even today, over 13 centuries later, her legacy remains stained with blood. This is the story of how a teenage concubine became the most powerful woman in the world, and how her ruthless ambition ultimately sealed her own dark fate. Wu Zetian's story begins not in a palace, but in relative obscurity. Born Wu Zhao around 624 CE, she entered the imperial court as nothing more than a fifth-tier concubine to Emperor Taizong, when she was just 14 years old. In the sprawling imperial harem, she was one of thousands of women competing for the emperor's attention. Most would live and die in anonymity, forgotten footnotes in the vast machinery of imperial power. But Wu Zetian was different. Even as a low-ranking concubine, she possessed something that set her apart from the other women in the harem. It wasn't just her beauty, though contemporary accounts suggest she was striking. It was her intelligence, her cunning, and most dangerously of all, her boundless ambition. While other concubines accepted their fate, Wu Zetian was already planning her escape from obscurity. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, a gilded prison where thousands of women lived in luxury but died in irrelevance. Competition was fierce and often deadly. Women would poison rivals, spread malicious rumors, or orchestrate elaborate schemes to gain even the smallest advantage. In this environment, Wu Zetian learned the first lessons that would define her reign. Trust no one, eliminate threats before they eliminate you, and never show mercy to those who stand in your way. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, Wu Zetian faced what should have been the end of her story. According to strict imperial tradition, all of the dead emperor's childless concubines were sent to Buddhist convents to live out their remaining days as nuns. This was considered a merciful fate, allowing them to spend their lives in quiet contemplation rather than execution. Wu Zetian was duly shipped off to a convent, her brief taste of palace life apparently over. But Wu Zetian had no intention of accepting this fate. During her time in Emperor Taizong's court, she had done something that would prove to be the key to her future. She had caught the attention of the emperor's son, Prince Li Ji. The exact nature of their relationship during Taizong's lifetime remains shrouded in mystery. But what is certain is that when Li Ji became Emperor Gaozong, he had not forgotten the striking young woman who had once served in his father's harem. In a move that shocked the imperial court, Emperor Gaozong recalled Wu Zetian from her convent and brought her back to the palace as one of his concubines. This was virtually unprecedented. For a woman to return from religious exile to the imperial harem was almost unheard of. But Gaozong was infatuated, and Wu Zetian had successfully orchestrated the first of many dramatic reversals of fortune that would define her extraordinary life. Back in the palace, Wu Zetian found herself in a familiar but even more dangerous situation. Emperor Gaozong already had an empress, Empress Wang, and a favored concubine, Consort Xiao. These two women had been locked in their own bitter rivalry for the emperor's affections, and Wu Zetian's arrival threatened to upset the delicate balance of power they had established. Empress Wang, perhaps recognizing Wu Zetian's intelligence and ambition, initially tried to use her as an ally against Consort Xiao. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Wu Zetian had not clawed her way back from a convent to serve as anyone's pawn. Instead, she began to play a game so sophisticated and ruthless that it would make Machiavelli himself take notes. Rather than align herself with either woman, Wu Zetian set about systematically destroying both of them. She began by winning Emperor Taizong's favor through a combination of intelligence, charm, and, most importantly, her ability to provide him with sons. In a world where male heirs were everything, Wu Zetian's fertility gave her a powerful weapon that neither Empress Wang nor consort Xiao could match. But Wu Zetian's master stroke came through an act so calculating and brutal that it would define her reputation for centuries to come. Historical accounts, though debated by modern scholars, tell of how Wu Zetian allegedly murdered her own infant daughter and then blamed the death on Empress Wang. According to these accounts, Wu Zetian gave birth to a daughter, and, when Empress Wang came to visit the child, Wu Zetian strangled the infant the moment the empress left the room. When Emperor Taizong arrived to see his daughter, he found Wu Zetian weeping over the child's lifeless body. She tearfully explained that Empress Wang had been the last person to see the baby alive, strongly implying that the empress had murdered the innocent child out of jealousy. Whether this horrific story is true or merely the invention of later historians seeking to demonize Wu Zetian, it perfectly encapsulates the depths of ruthlessness she was willing to plumb to achieve her goals. The alleged infanticide provided Wu Zetian with the ammunition she needed to destroy her rivals. She convinced Emperor Taizong that both Empress Wang and consort Xiao were not just rivals but active threats to the imperial family. She spun elaborate tales of their supposed plots against the emperor and their use of black magic to curse her and her children. In the paranoid atmosphere of the imperial court, these accusations took root and grew. Emperor Taizong, now completely under Wu Zetian's influence, moved against his empress and former favorite concubine with shocking brutality. Both women were stripped of their titles, imprisoned, and subjected to interrogation and torture. But Wu Zetian was not content with mere imprisonment. She wanted to ensure that these women could never threaten her again, and she wanted to send a message to anyone else who might dare to oppose her. The execution of Empress Wang and consort Xiao remains one of the most horrifying episodes in Chinese imperial history. Wu Zetian reportedly ordered that both women have their hands and feet severed while they were still alive. Their mutilated bodies were then thrown into a large vat filled with wine, where they were left to drown in agony. As they died, Wu Zetian allegedly remarked that they had been turned into human pigs, a phrase that would haunt her reputation for centuries. This gruesome execution served multiple purposes for Wu Zetian. It eliminated her two most dangerous rivals, but more importantly, it established her reputation as someone who would stop at nothing to protect her position. The message was clear. Oppose Wu Zetian at your own peril, because she would not simply defeat you, she would destroy you in the most horrific way imaginable. With her rivals eliminated, Wu Zetian was elevated to the position of empress in 655 CE. This was an extraordinary achievement for a woman who had started as a low-ranking concubine and had even been exiled to a convent. But Wu Zetian was just getting started. Her ultimate goal was not to be the power behind the throne, but to be the throne itself. Emperor Taizong's declining health provided Wu Zetian with the opportunity she needed to consolidate her power. In 660 CE, the emperor suffered a debilitating stroke that left him partially paralyzed and increasingly dependent on his empress for even basic functions. Wu Zetian stepped into this power vacuum with ruthless efficiency, effectively becoming the de facto ruler of the Chinese empire, while maintaining the fiction that she was merely helping her disabled husband. From behind a screen in the imperial court, Wu Zetian began making all the major decisions of state. She appointed officials, decided military campaigns, and shaped domestic policy with an iron fist. Her administrative abilities, even her harshest critics admitted, were formidable. She proved to be an effective ruler, strengthening the central government, reducing corruption, and expanding China's borders through successful military campaigns. But Wu Zetian's rule was also marked by an atmosphere of terror that permeated every level of government. She established an extensive network of secret police and informers who monitored the loyalty of officials and citizens alike. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could expect a midnight visit from her agents, followed by interrogation, torture, and often execution. This reign of terror ensured that few dared to openly oppose her, but it also created a climate of fear and paranoia that would define her legacy. When Emperor Taizong finally died in 683 CE, Wu Zetian faced the greatest challenge of her career. As Empress Dowager, she was expected to step back and allow her son to rule as the new emperor. But Wu Zetian had not spent decades accumulating power only to hand it over to anyone, including her own children. She placed her son Li Xian on the throne as Emperor Zhongzong, but it quickly became clear that she intended to remain the real power behind the throne. Emperor Zhongzong, however, proved to be more independent than his mother had anticipated. He began making his own appointments and decisions, effectively challenging Wu Zetian's authority. This was a mistake that would cost him dearly. Within a single month of his coronation, Wu Zetian had deposed her own son and sent him into exile. The message was unmistakable. No one, not even her own flesh and blood, would be allowed to challenge her supremacy. Wu Zetian replaced the deposed emperor with her youngest son, Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruizong. Unlike his brother, Ruizong proved to be completely compliant, serving as nothing more than a puppet while his mother continued to wield absolute power. But even this arrangement was not enough for Wu Zetian. She had tasted ultimate power, and she wanted it officially recognized. In 690 CE, Wu Zetian took the most audacious step in Chinese history. She forced her puppet son to abdicate and declared herself Emperor of China, establishing her own Zhou Dynasty and effectively interrupting the Tang Dynasty that had ruled for nearly a century. By 705 CE, the once mighty Empress Wu Zetian found herself trapped in a web of her own making. The woman who had ruthlessly climbed to the pinnacle of power was about to discover that maintaining absolute control comes with an inevitable price. Her final years would be marked by paranoia, scandal, and ultimately, a dramatic fall that would seal her dark fate forever. As Wu Zetian entered her 80s, her iron grip on the empire began to weaken. Age and declining health made her increasingly dependent on those around her, a vulnerability she had never before experienced. The empress, who had once eliminated rivals with surgical precision, now found herself relying heavily on a group of young male favorites who would ultimately contribute to her downfall. Chief among these were the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, handsome young men who gained unprecedented influence over the aging ruler. The Zhang brothers represented everything that Wu Zetian's critics had long feared about female rule. While male emperors throughout Chinese history had maintained vast harems without significant condemnation, Wu's relationship with these young men scandalized the court and provided ammunition for her enemies. The brothers were not merely companions, but wielded genuine political power, making decisions that affected the entire empire. Their corruption and arrogance grew unchecked as Wu Zetian became increasingly infatuated with them, seeing in their youth perhaps a way to recapture her own vitality. Zhang Yizhi, the elder brother, was particularly notorious for his manipulative nature. He understood exactly how to play upon the empress's vanities and fears, convincing her that he possessed magical abilities to preserve her youth and extend her life. The younger brother, Zhang Changzong, was equally cunning, using his physical beauty and charm to secure lucrative government positions for himself and his allies. Together, they formed a corrupt inner circle that gradually isolated Wu Zetian from her traditional power base of loyal ministers and generals. The influence of these favorites created a dangerous shift in the court's power dynamics. Officials who had served Wu Zetian faithfully for decades found themselves marginalized, their advice ignored in favor of the Zhang brothers' whispered counsel. The empress, who had once prided herself on administrative efficiency and merit-based appointments, now handed out positions based on personal favoritism. This departure from her earlier principles eroded the loyalty of the very people who had helped her maintain power for so long. Meanwhile, the secret police apparatus that had once been Wu Zetian's most effective tool for controlling dissent began to turn against her. Many of the brutal enforcers she had relied upon, including the notorious Lai Junchen, had themselves fallen victim to the system they helped create. As these figures were eliminated through palace purges and power struggles, Wu Zetian lost the network of fear and surveillance that had kept potential rebels in check. The very mechanisms of terror she had perfected were crumbling just when she needed them most. The Empress's paranoia, always a defining characteristic of her rule, reached new heights during this period. She began to suspect treachery everywhere, often based on the poisonous whispers of the Zhang brothers who used her fears to eliminate their own rivals. This created a vicious cycle where loyal officials were punished for imaginary crimes, while genuine threats went unnoticed. The court became a maze of shifting alliances and hidden agendas, with everyone looking out for their own survival rather than the stability of the empire. Perhaps most damaging to Wu Zetian's position was her treatment of the traditional Tang loyalists and members of the Li imperial family who had survived her earlier purges. These individuals, many of whom had grudgingly accepted her rule when she appeared strong and capable, began to see weakness in her dependence on the Zhang brothers. They started to organize quietly, forming networks of resistance that would eventually coalesce into the conspiracy that brought her down. The Empress, who had once been so skilled at detecting and crushing opposition, was now blind to the growing movement against her. The economic prosperity that had marked much of Wu Zetian's reign also began to falter under the corrupt influence of her favorites. The Zhang brothers and their associates engaged in massive embezzlement, selling government positions to the highest bidders and diverting state resources for their personal use. This corruption trickled down through all levels of government, undermining the efficient administration that had been one of Wu Zetian's greatest achievements. As economic problems mounted, public support for the Empress began to erode. Religious opposition also played a crucial role in Wu Zetian's downfall. While she had successfully used Buddhism to legitimize her rule as a female emperor, many Confucian scholars and traditional court officials had never fully accepted this religious justification. As her rule became increasingly erratic and corrupt, these voices grew louder in their condemnation. They pointed to the chaos surrounding the Zhang brothers as evidence that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Zhou Dynasty, a powerful argument in a society that believed deeply in the divine right of rulers. The military, which had been largely loyal to Wu Zetian throughout her reign, also began to show signs of discontent. Generals who had served her faithfully watched in dismay as military appointments went to unqualified favorites rather than experienced commanders. The army's effectiveness began to decline, and border regions that had been secure under Wu Zetian's strong leadership started to experience increased instability. This military weakness was perhaps the most dangerous development of all, as it left the Empress vulnerable to the very type of palace coup that would ultimately destroy her. As 705 CE dawned, the conspiracy against Wu Zetian had crystallized around a group of determined officials led by Zhang Jianji and Kui Xuanwei. These men were not power-hungry rebels, but loyal servants of the Tang Dynasty who genuinely believed that the Empress's rule had become detrimental to the empire. They carefully planned their moves, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike when Wu Zetian would be most vulnerable and least able to rally her remaining supporters. The conspirators understood that their success depended on eliminating the Zhang brothers first, as these favorites were the primary source of the Empress's remaining power. They also knew that they needed to present their actions not as a rebellion against legitimate authority, but as a restoration of proper order. This careful framing would be crucial to gaining support from officials and military commanders who might otherwise hesitate to move against the Empress. The stage was set for the dramatic confrontation that would end Wu Zetian's unprecedented reign. The woman who had survived countless palace intrigues, eliminated numerous rivals, and defied every convention of her society was about to face her greatest challenge. The very qualities that had brought her to power, her ruthlessness, her paranoia, her willingness to destroy anyone who threatened her, had ultimately created the conditions for her own destruction. The irony of Wu Zetian's situation was profound. She had spent decades eliminating potential threats to her rule, only to find herself threatened by the consequences of those very actions. The loyal officials she had purged might have warned her of the growing conspiracy. The traditional power structures she had dismantled might have provided stability in her final years. The fear she had instilled in others had created a court where honest counsel was impossible, leaving her isolated and vulnerable when she most needed reliable allies. As winter approached in 705 CE, the Empress Wu Zetian, now 81 years old and in failing health, remained unaware that her enemies were closing in. The Zhang brothers continued their corrupt practices, confident in their ability to manipulate the aging ruler. But beneath the surface of court routine, the final act of one of history's most remarkable and ruthless reigns was about to begin. The conspiracy against Wu Zetian had been brewing for months, with court officials meeting in secret, their whispered conversations filled with urgent plans. Zhang Jianji, a seasoned Tang loyalist, and Kui Xuanwei, a respected general, had quietly gathered support from discontented ministers and military commanders who watched in disgust as the aging empress lavished power upon her corrupt favorites. The Zhang brothers had grown increasingly reckless, openly flaunting their influence and treating court officials with contempt, creating the perfect storm for rebellion. On a cold February night in 705 CE, the conspirators struck with swift precision. The Shenlong coup, as it would become known, unfolded like a carefully choreographed execution. Armed guards loyal to the Tang cause stormed the palace quarters where the Zhang brothers resided, catching them completely off guard. Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong, the two men who had wielded such tremendous power over the empress, were brutally slaughtered along with their closest allies. Their screams echoed through the palace corridors as decades of resentment found violent expression. Wu Zetian, now 81 years old and physically frail, was powerless to stop the carnage. The woman who had once commanded absolute fear and respect found herself isolated and defenseless as her last loyal supporters were systematically eliminated. The coup leaders justified their actions by claiming the empress had been bewitched by her male favorites and was no longer capable of effective rule. They presented her with an ultimatum that was really no choice at all: abdicate immediately or face the same fate as the Zhang brothers. The forced abdication came swiftly and mercilessly. Wu Zetian, the woman who had defied every convention to become China's only female emperor, was stripped of her titles and power in a matter of hours. Her Zhou Dynasty, which she had proclaimed with such audacious confidence 15 years earlier, crumbled overnight. The conspirators wasted no time in restoring her son Li Xian to the throne as Emperor Zhongzong, effectively erasing her revolutionary reign and reinstating the Tang Dynasty she had interrupted. The psychological devastation was perhaps even more crushing than the physical coup itself. Wu Zetian had spent her entire adult life accumulating and wielding power, eliminating anyone who dared challenge her authority. Now she found herself completely powerless, dependent on the mercy of the very people she had once terrorized. The secret police apparatus she had used to crush dissent was dismantled. Her loyal officials were either executed or exiled, and her carefully constructed network of control dissolved into nothing. Her health, already declining, deteriorated rapidly following the traumatic events of the coup. The stress of losing everything she had fought for, combined with the advanced age of 81, took a devastating toll on her body and mind. Reports from the palace described her as a shadow of her former self, barely eating and rarely speaking. The woman who had once commanded armies and directed the fate of millions now spent her days in virtual isolation, attended only by a handful of servants who dared not meet her eyes. The bitter irony of her downfall was not lost on those who witnessed it. Wu Zetian had risen to power by eliminating rivals and consolidating control through fear and brutality. Yet she fell victim to the very same tactics she had perfected. The conspirators who removed her used her own methods against her, demonstrating that the ruthless pursuit of power ultimately creates the conditions for its own destruction. Her reliance on the Zhang brothers, born from loneliness and the paranoia that had isolated her from trustworthy advisors, became the weakness that her enemies exploited. Just 10 months after her forced abdication, Wu Zetian died in December 705 CE, alone and forgotten by most of the empire she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her death was met with neither the mourning typically reserved for emperors nor the celebration one might expect for such a controversial figure. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence, as if the empire itself was uncertain how to process the end of such an extraordinary and terrifying reign. Her burial, alongside Emperor Taizong in the Qianling Mausoleum, was itself a final act of historical ambiguity. The massive blank stele that marks her tomb stands as perhaps the most fitting monument to her complex legacy. Some historians believe she requested the wordless stone, confident that her achievements would speak for themselves and that future generations would judge her more fairly than her contemporaries. Others suggest that her successors simply could not agree on how to summarize a reign that had been simultaneously transformative and horrifying. The blank stele has become a powerful symbol of the questions that surround Wu Zetian's legacy. Was she a visionary leader who broke gender barriers and governed effectively? Or was she a ruthless tyrant whose cruelty overshadowed any positive contributions? The answer, like the stele itself, remains frustratingly empty, forcing each generation to grapple with the contradictions of her reign and draw their own conclusions about this most enigmatic of rulers. In the end, Wu Zetian's dark fate serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the inevitable price of ruling through fear. Her extraordinary rise from concubine to emperor demonstrated that traditional barriers could be shattered through intelligence, determination, and strategic ruthlessness. However, her dramatic fall revealed that such power, when maintained through brutality and paranoia, ultimately becomes unsustainable. The empress, who had eliminated so many rivals in her quest for security, found that her methods had created an empire of enemies, and when her strength finally failed, there was no one left to protect her from the very forces she had unleashed.